Okay, so today I thought I would do just to talk you through my editing process on this image. Now, I'll show you what we're going to just quickly get to. This is our finished product. This has obviously gone through Lightroom, and I've taken it into Photoshop and then back into Lightroom again. So I'm just going to take you through my process. This is just what I do. It's my personal preference. It's the way I want my images to look. Basically speaking, if there's anything in here that you like, you can use. Great, wonderful. And if you don't like the editing process at all, no problems. So just first things first, I do quite a lot. I've always been a strong editor. I find it works more to my personal taste and style. So I'm just going to talk you through what I do. I'm not going to pitch this too low or too high. I'm going to assume that you know how to use software, largely speaking, before I get started. Anyway, right, so first things first, we're going to fix the white balance. I shot this on Canon 6D with a 16 to 35 millimeter f4L lens, shot at 35 millimeters, as you can see there, f11, 15 seconds, ISO 100. I'm pretty sure that the filters used in this were a Nisi ND Grad 0.9 soft, the Lee Landscape Polarizer, which I now no longer use, and the Lee Little Stopper, which I also now no longer use. I've switched over to Nisi exclusively. So, because I've used the Little Stopper, it's put a slightly blue cast on the image, which we're going to fix just by taking the eyedropper first of all, finding something as neutral grey as possible. I'll probably adjust it anyway. That'll do. So, a little bit more magenta for my tastes, I think, and just a little warmer, but we'll see. It will probably change as we go on. So first things first, I'm going to bung a little contrast in. It's going to darken the darks a little bit too much, but we'll get to that in a second. So I always bring the highlights down to minus 100, and I always bring the shadows up to plus 100. When I say always, there are some times where I probably wouldn't do that necessarily. Then we're going to find our black and white point. I'm going to try and keep an eye on my histogram, try and keep it pretty central. Clarity, I'm going to drop down. I don't like harshness in the images, really, so I'll explain that towards the end when we get into sharpening and whatnot. And I'm just going to boost the vibrance slightly. Now, these will probably all change in due course, but for now, this will do. I'm going to go to the tone curve, and you'll notice I've checked the little button here in the bottom right-hand corner, because I just like to bring the absolute black just up a touch, so that we don't lose everything. It gives it a slightly less contrasty feel, even though I'm going to dial in some contrast now by putting the curves down in the shadows and bring them up in the highlights. We're getting a little bit bright here, but if you follow my images, you'll know that I always add a vignette, which will darken things anyway. I don't do any sharpening in Lightroom, none whatsoever, so I take that right out. That all gets done in Photoshop. Now, noise reduction, I'm always going to bring in a little bit, just a touch, and for every 10 points of luminance noise reduction I bring in, I add 10 points of detail. I think it's just sort of balances things out. It doesn't make things too soft. We're obviously going to check our chromatic aberration. There's possibly some around the rocks here, but we're going to check it anyway. Also, I'm going to enable profile corrections, which will brighten the image. Notice the histogram's nice to the right, but that's not the way I like things. So I'm going to bring things down a bit using a vignette, just to bring the focus into the middle, the viewer's focus into the middle of the image. Now, I always feather it. I like to hide my edits as much as possible because there's so many. So I always feather it 100%, and then just find a nice balance between looking at the histogram and looking at the image itself and seeing what works for you. Now, a nice little trick to retain some original colours that were there when I first took the image is, rather than applying the standard Adobe profile, I actually go into the standard camera profile. So the profile that this will give you a better idea of the colours and saturation that were there at the time. So we're getting pretty close now. One thing I will say is I think the sky is just a tad. Well, I don't know. Let's just. I'm going to bring in a gradient filter, and I think I'm going to just bring in a bit more magenta and a little bit more blues. There we go. Oops. And just a touch down on an exposure. So I'm pretty happy with that. I've noticed that the usual sensor spots are still here, so I'm just going to clone them out pretty quickly. I've also got some, on my camera, I've got some noisy pixels from doing long exposures all the time. So I'm just going to clone them out too. I'm going to just quite clean at the end. So bear with me, I may speed this up so that you don't have to suffer through the cloning process, but I suspect there's going to be quite a few kicking about. I seem to recall there was one down here. Maybe not. I'm holding down the spacebar, by the way, and then when you're zoomed into 1:1, you can still move the image around whilst being zoomed in. Nice little trick that, some people don't know that one. I learned lots of the things I do in editing from people like Anthony Morganti online on YouTube, and also Michael Shaneblum. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Apologies if I've got that wrong, Michael. And yeah, just a few other guys, a few other tips that seem to work for me. So there we are. So that's basically the image now processed in Lightroom. I'm going to take this over into Photoshop to really bring out, really enhance it. That's where the real magic, I think, happens in Photoshop. Right, so we're going to right click. We're going to go to Edit in, open a smart object in Photoshop. Hopefully Photoshop will launch. Okay, so I used to use the Nik software pack, and I've actually moved away from it recently. I only used to use it for sharpening, but I had a conversation with Patrick Ong recently about sharpening, and he was very kind to give me some tips for the way he thinks is best to sharpen it, and I followed his tips, and he's absolutely 100% spot on. Very, 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 very clean, sharp images for web publishing. Anyway, right, so I've got the TK Actions panel, version 4, I believe version 5's out, but I haven't upgraded as yet. I don't use this, I use this, but not a huge amount. I keep it pretty straightforward. I use it to select lights, midtones and darks, and then do some curves. Anyway, I'll show you what I do. So first of all, lights. And you can see that it's selected the light part of the image, lighter parts of the image. I'm going to choose curves. I'm going to double click here on the layer, and I'm just going to drag that down a bit. So we just take a little bit of the light out of the sky and on the water. It's going to make it look a little flat, but it's okay. The next one really makes it pop. So back to TK, over to midtones. I always use midtones 2. Just personal preference. It seems to work for me. So again, curves, double click, and I'm going to make a bit more of an S curve on this one. And you'll see that just lowering it at the lower end, the darker end, and then just bringing it out at the top end can really make the image pop. One thing that I'll say that I'm going to do is that obviously it's made things a wee bit too dark. So I'm going to go back into the TK panel, go to Darks 1, but this time I use levels. I find I've got a bit more control the way I need to with levels. So I'll just click that and double click. Now I always bring in a bit, make it a bit darker at the very dark end, and in the middle and the top end of the darks can come up a wee bit. We don't want it too, we want nice and punchy detail, but we don't want it too dark. So just compare it, you can see before and after. So it's got a nice range and depth of tone. Right, next thing is I am going to do put an Orton effect on the image, which will blur things slightly, and it gives it a more soft feel. The way I do it is the way that Michael Shainblum does it. You can check out his videos and he'll show you the way he does it. And that's just where I learned it from. So first of all, we're going to have to flatten our layers down, and then we're going to go to filter. Oh, sorry, no, we're going to convert it to a smart object first, so that we can alter the adjustments after they've been made. Now I'm going to create a duplicate of the layer by dragging down into here, and then I'm going to go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and I leave mine set at around 30.3 pixels. That's about as strong as I like it. Click OK, and then up to image, adjustments, brightness and contrast. I make this brightness 15 usually, contrast 100 always. That's going to look horrible, but we're going to change the opacity of the layer down to about 20%. So we've got a fair amount of detail still, but still a bit of a nice softness to it. But you'll probably find that it's a little too soft, so we're going to add some high pass. So again, another duplicate of the layer. Go to filter, other, high pass, and 4.5 is a decent radius for most of my work. Any further that way, it's too strong, and any further this way, it's a little bit too soft. So just leave that at 4.5 pixels, okay? And then I'm going to grab this layer and drag it above the blur, and select soft light from the drop-down box here. Opacity, not 100%, roughly 35% usually seems to suit what I've got. Right, so that's our Orton effect now. The next step that I do here is sharpening. So this is the method that was recommended to me by Patrick Ong, a superb photographer as well. Definitely check out his work. If you go to the TK panel and go Actions, recommend if you're publishing for web, which most of us are doing these days, 2048 on the long side. And I leave about 70%. Then just click OK. And it will do its thing. Next thing, we'll probably want to just add a little bit more sharpening just to bring it out. So we need to add another filter, but first of all we need to flatten the layer, and then into filter, sharpen, smart sharpen. Your amount should be 150%, radius 0.3 of a pixel. You can reduce noise just so that we don't get anything unpleasant, any unpleasant artifacts. Remove lens blur. I've actually no idea what that does. I can't tell the difference when I've run it. But anyway, so click OK to that, and it will run its sharpen mask. Now, if we go back out and have a look at the image now, I'm pretty happy with that. That's starting to look nice and the sort of effect I like to have in my images. I think these little shells could be annoying, but we'll maybe have a look at them in a minute. So we're going to save for web. You're making sure your quality is 100% important. Otherwise, you'll just, I mean, you can obviously change that if you're wanting to create a smaller file. So I'm just going to save that. I've got my own file system separate to, I don't let Lightroom or Photoshop do any of my file systems. I do it myself. That way I know where things are. So I know where it's going to the right place, so that's fine. I'm going to save that. We've already got a copy here, of course, because I've already edited this image, so I'm going to give it a second name. And we'll call it copy 2, save. Right, so back over to Lightroom now, and we're going to re-import the image. And hopefully it should come up quickly. There we are. Right, so that's it. Brought back into Lightroom now. And it looks pretty good. And I have no real reason for doing this. But I think it was Serge Ramelli who is another great YouTuber for editing and photography advice. He always calls it the double edit, as he would say. And I kind of like it, so it just makes it pop even more. So I'm just going to, just a fraction of contrast, bring those highlights down just a notch, so we get a bit more detail in the cloud here. We don't want to lose anything too much in the shadows, so I'm just going to bring them up a notch. Again, white point just to make it really, really sort of pop out, and then a bit more black point so that we've got a little bit of darkness creeping in. Again, clarity, we can bring that down just a notch because the sharpening can sometimes make it look overly harsh if you're not careful. At this point, again, no sharpening here. Probably shouldn't need any noise reduction at all, I wouldn't have thought. No, it looks absolutely fine. We don't need to apply corrections, we've already done that. What I will do is get rid of these little shells, because I think on web they may be a bit of a distraction. Maybe this one as well, just a little one. I'm just using the clone stamp there to do that. It's a nice simple tool. I'm going to check for any hot pixels again. I'm sure there's probably some here that I'm missing. But otherwise, I think we're looking pretty good. So that's that. Yeah, I think we're okay. I think we are. There'll probably be somebody screaming, watching this video, saying you've missed one. There it is. There. Sorry about that. Anyway, right. So let's sort that out. So now we're good to go. So to export, I do very little. I've got, like I said, I've got my own file system. Image settings, RGB for your color space, JPEG obviously, 100% for the quality. Sizing, 500 pixels per inch seems to be work for me, where I'm uploading to 500px and Flickr mostly, and they seem to work. So sharpening, none at all. You can leave the metadata if you want, and I apply my watermark as per usual. And post-processing, it should hopefully just open in the Finder. So we're going to click export, nice and quick, and there we have it. Now, let's just see, this will be the big test to see whether or not it's looking the same as the one I did earlier. So let's have a look at the original one. So there it is. Just a little bit more punchy this second time. It's interesting. So just a slight change in color temperature, I think, as well. The second one being a little bit more blue. Anyway, it's relatively consistent though, which is good. So that's basically how I edit my images. If you find that helpful, fantastic. If you haven't, I'm sorry. Feel free to give me some comments as to maybe some suggestions that to help it make it more fluid for you. Obviously, we can pause, and if you need to, I've gone quite quickly, so feel free to pause the video and work on what you do and come back. Anyway, hopefully, as I said, that is helpful, and yeah, okay, bye for now.